A very good evening to one and all present here. Arthur C. Clarke opines thus: science fiction seldom attempts to predict the future. More often than not, it tries to prevent the future. Welcome back to the second day of the Faculty Development Program on Science Fiction. At the outset, I'd like to welcome the chief guest, Dr. Lekshmi Nair, Associate Professor of the Department of English, Government College, Kottayam. I feel welcome, ma'am. I feel elated to welcome the participants back to the second day of this program on science fiction. I take pleasure in welcoming our principal, Dr. Pal Dayabran, who keeps supporting the department in all its endeavors. Welcome, sir. I extend a gracious welcome to the advisory committee comprising Dr. Shobna, head of the department, and Dr. Dhanapal, coordinator of Shift 2 and Dean of Training and Placement. Welcome, ma'am, and welcome, sir. We have amidst us the organizing secretary, Dr. Suresh Frederick, UG head of the Department of English and Dean of Research and Development of the college. Welcome, sir. I also welcome the organizing team, research scholars, and students of the department. I welcome one and all one more time to the second day of the session. We have also joining with us today Dr. Arun Lal, who was a session expert yesterday, who spoke on the poetics of the post-human. Welcome, sir. So, to say a few words about today's resource person, Dr. Lekshmi Nair is an associate professor of the Department of English, Government College, Kottayam, Kerala. Her doctoral thesis was a study of popular culture in science fiction, and her areas of expertise include gender studies, post-human studies, speculative fiction, and trauma studies. She is the editor of the book Dialectic of Trauma, Experience and Language, which is due to be published shortly. She is a research supervisor at Mahatma Gandhi University, Kerala, who has published extensively in national and international journals and has contributed to edited volumes on areas of contemporary critical interest. She is here to address the participants on the topic Reality Ahead of Schedule, Tools of Scholarship. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yeah. Ma'am. Yes.
Thank you. Well, today I plan to talk about the genre science fiction, look at some of the thematic concerns that the genre addresses, and also at some of the theoretical perspectives. Science fiction is considered as one of 20th century's most prominent.
Ma'am, excuse me, ma'am.
Yes?
Ma'am, sorry for disturbing you, but your audio seems to be a little unclear, ma'am.
Just a moment.
It could be because of the fan, ma'am.
Is it fine now?
Yes, ma'am. It's very clear. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Now, science fiction, I plan to talk about some of the theoretical concerns that are relevant to genre science fiction. But before that, I'll be talking about some of the thematic concerns and hope to give you a basic introduction to the genre. Of course, I shall not be talking about humanism because it has already been spoken about in yesterday's session. So I'll stay clear of that. Now, talking about science fiction, it is considered as one of 20th century's most dominant and most characteristic literary forms. And it has often been referred to as imaginative fiction set in a fantasy world of spaceships, ray guns, monsters, automatons, etc. And basically it explores the imaginative potentials of modern day scientific facts. And it harks back to the literary intention of depicting human beings in relation to the entities, and it uh, sought to kind of terminate man's preoccupation with himself. And we can say that science fiction rose as a type of as a reactionary type of reading in the wake of the scientific temperament that swept across Europe and America in the 18th and 19th centuries. And the rapid pace of scientific progress and technological innovations uh, developed in man consciousness of his immediate environment, combined with a consciousness of his place in the scheme of things. And writers, theorists, and critics, they have and even editors of science fiction magazines, they have attempted to define science fiction often in their own terms. And Gregory Benford, he claims that science fiction is a controlled way to think and dream about the future. Many science fiction fantasies we know construct whole galactic civilizations, incorporating a great number of planets with their different cultures and ways of living. And it creates an alternate world or a second universe, incorporating man's utopian desires and his dystopian fears. And we can say that the genres focus on representations of science and technology is one of the defining aspects of science fiction writing. It is a genre that is born of technology, and much of its appeal rests on its elegant projections of technological trends into the future. And it is a literary form that is based on hard science and is concerned with the practical effects of that science on human affairs. And in pursuit of its imaginative purposes, science fiction has occasionally come up with an authentic and scientifically detailed forecast of man's future. And this has led to the popular belief that science fiction is prophetic in some fundamental way. But science fiction is rarely didactic. It merely extrapolates possible futures of mankind in an era of great technological upheavals. And the presence of machines in our environment has conditioned our thinking along certain lines. It has altered the very way we think, feel, and view the world around us. And science fiction deals with the future of mankind at large, and it explores the consequences of technological determinism. And some writers of the genre, they visualize a lonely humanity struggling against a very monstrous, debasing machine world, while others try to depict a technological evolution which is monitored, directed, and controlled by man. And it often portrays future worlds where man could take giant strides towards colonizing the entire galaxy in his quest for extra living space. And the writers of science fiction also suggest the possibility of an imminent collapse or a complete destruction of man's homeland, And in his quest for knowledge and power, man is likely to commit mistakes which may prove to be self destructive. Another thematic concern of science fiction is with regard to uh, the presence of alien civilizations with superior technology. This has also been emphatically suggested in many science fiction stories. And this sounds warning to humanity to caution them that they are not the only species capable of calling themselves the masters of the universe. However, I would say that science fiction stories it uh, tends tend to place human beings at the center of the universe. Human beings are firmly and unmistakably part of the natural world that they have taken for their dominion. And in this context, I would invite your attention to Sir Edward Bernard Tyler, one of the pioneers in the field of anthropology, who declares that the study of man and civilization is a means of understanding our own lives and our place in the world. And this knowledge of man's course of life from the remote past to the present will help us forecast the future and guide us in leaving the world a better place than we found it. Human culture and civilization, as we know, is in a state of continuous, is in a state of progressive evolution. And science fiction actually attempts to review human progress down the ages. And at the same time, it speculates on the possibilities of alternate modes of evolution, existence, and expansion for the human race. And science fiction often transforms or suspends the familiar aspects of our reality as it speculates about future possibilities. And its depictions of utopias and dystopias are not mere narrative approaches to the future. In fact, you might already be familiar with the concepts of utopia and dystopia. Utopia is an ideal place where mankind has conquered sickness, poverty, racism, suffering, death, warfare, etc. And in a dystopia, the negative social trends are taken to a nightmarish extreme, and life is bleak and it is devoid of happiness. In fact, both utopias and dystopias imagine worlds that are radically different from our known world, and they serve as critiques of our own civilization. And they are, in a sense, manifestations of the human response to changes in science and technology. And science fiction writers, they assimilate a new technology and inspire us to imagine ways in which we could restructure our future. And these visualizations of alternate futures actually urge us to act in order to either realize it or to prevent it. Thus, we can say that science fiction is a major step in the progressive evolution of humanity. And these fictionalizations of utopias and dystopias are vital as imaginative creations that ensure the sustenance of our culture and our civilization. Now, very briefly, I shall talk about the history and development of the genre because I don't want to go into the details of it. Um, Science fiction is a very diverse literary genre, and it is one of the most influential forms of what you say, futuristic thinking in the modern world. And it is a literature that draws directly from popular culture, and it engages in very audacious speculations about the future. But we can say that the subject matter of science fiction has been touched upon in literature since ancient times. We have literature that talks about imaginary voyages to the moon, about heroic protagonists seeking out new worlds and strange new civilizations, tales of strange people in distant lands. These were all common in ancient Greek and Roman literature. And talking about the origins of the genre, several scholars point out that the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, which was written around 2000 BC, it is considered as the oldest epic of human culture. And it dealt with the search for ultimate knowledge and immortality. And the protagonist, he encounters monsters in strange new lands, and this actually provides the science fictional element and presumably the encounter with otherness in modern science fiction terminology. Around 2nd century, we have another work, True History, by Lucian of Samosata. And it is cited as one of the early examples of proto-science fiction. Its theme involved a trip to the moon. The ship of the narrator is caught in a hurricane, and he is hurled into the sky from where it sails onto the moon. In another of Lucian's work, Icaromenipus, the hero flew off to the moon using the wings of a vulture and an eagle. Even you have the Greek myths of Daedalus and Icarus, which was concerned with what you call the technology of flying. And again, the structure of better societies or better worlds became one of the subject matters of science fiction. And the fictional treatment of this concept of an ideal land, it dates back to the 4th century BC when the famous Greek philosopher Plato, he wrote his classic, The Republic. And this theme was later reintroduced into literature by Thomas More through his monumental work Utopia, published in 1516, in which the author recreated an ideal society on a crescent-shaped island where everybody coexisted harmoniously. Later in 1627, the English philosopher Sir Francis Bacon, he envisioned a better world in his work, The New Atlantis, which again dealt with life on the fictional island of Bensalem. In 1726, you have Jonathan Swift's masterpiece, Gulliver's Travels, which had for its theme the imaginary voyages of the protagonist to strange new lands. Thus, we can say that science fictional elements could be traced to literature as ancient as the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, the Industrial Revolution of 1750, it fueled the imagination of many writers, and it led to the emergence of science fiction in its present form. The surge of scientific temperament in the early 19th century, it actually laid the foundations of modern science fiction. The publication of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or Modern Prometheus, in 1818, it marks the culmination of the Gothic novels of the 18th century. But the science fiction writer Brian Aldiss, he regards Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as the first science fiction text, or what he calls original proto-science fiction, that explored the potential of science for good or evil. Now, the standards of modern science fiction were defined by H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, the two pioneers of the field. Both were rightly acclaimed as the fathers of science fiction. And they wrote science fiction with astonishing fertility, and it paved the way for the growth of science fiction as a meaningful, imaginative category in its own right. However, the golden age of 20th century imaginative literature ushered in with the rise of John W. Campbell Jr., uh, as he became the editor of Astounding Stories, the magazine Astounding Stories, in the year 1937. And Campbell, he believed that science had a dual function, that science could educate as it entertained. And equal emphasis was laid on hard science and also on the imaginative potential of science. And Campbell wished to produce works of literary merit, uh, integrating scientific facts into the story. And in his stories, he placed he placed science fiction center stage, and he um, focused on the ways in which people actually responded to, and how people were influenced by the technical and the prophetic aspects of science fiction. Now, after Campbell, you have writers like Robert Heinlein and Van Vogt, who followed Campbellian footsteps and produced works that guaranteed what you call a feast of wonder. They remained the mainstays of Astounding Stories for quite some time. And in 1938, Astounding Stories was renamed as Astounding Science Fiction. In 1949, you see the emergence of another science fiction magazine, the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, which was founded by Anthony Boucher and Francis McComas. It was followed by H.L. Gold with his Galaxy Science Fiction. And we can say that the writers like Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, Ray Bradbury, you have James Blish, Ursula K. Le Guin, all these are Senna Henderson, all these are considered as masters of the genre. And the 1980s actually witnessed the birth of another variant of the genre known as cyberpunk literature. And it was the science fiction writer Bruce Bethke who coined the term cyberpunk as the title of one of his short stories published in 1983. And the term was subsequently used to describe a variety of stories and novels about the information explosion of the 1980s. Intricate plot structures and technological details characterize cyberpunk literature, and it kind of mirrors the dazzled and confused reality of the present. Science fiction began to be recognized as a literature of relevance in the 20th century. And the explosion of the first atom bomb in Hiroshima in 1945, the successful space flight of the Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin in 1961, and Neil Armstrong's landing on the moon in 1969 were considered as major events that influenced human consciousness and shattered his belief in the accepted and familiar order of the world around him. Atomic energy and space flight became the favorite themes of science fiction writers. It has been one of the favorite themes of writers almost from its beginning. And a tradition of space operas set in stories that were set in the near to the distant future, featuring interstellar civilizations or galactic civilizations, exotic technologies, and large scale, cosmic scale conflicts, etc. As Camille Bacon Smith in Science Fiction Culture comments, the obvious place to look for the postmodern culture is the science fiction community, because science fiction, it imagines change in terms of the whole species, and these changes are often results of scientific discoveries and inventions that are applied by human beings to their own social evolution. Now, at a later stage, towards the second part of the 20th century, science fiction began to explore the potential of science to tamper with the genetic framework, creating fictional mutants and clones. Mutation, which is considered as the ultimate mode of biological change, is an enduring theme in science fiction. Mutation leads to evolution, and it's a principle that is of central importance to genre science fiction. The manipulation of mutation and evolution by humans, which we call genetic engineering in scientific terms, is one of the central concerns in science fiction today. And we have a plethora of mutant stories and tales of alien encounters, which impart a very strong sensational quotient to science fiction, and which contributes greatly to its entertainment value and also its popular appeal. You might be familiar with Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park, which explores the theme of genetic mutation, cloning, and evolution, doctored in state-of-the-art laboratories. And we have H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, which deals with the spread and mutation of microbial life forms. Again, you have Michael Crichton's Andromeda Strain, which speculates on the threat posed by a deadly mutant microbe strain from outer space. You have the 1997 film Gattaca, which boldly depicts what might happen if society took DNA perfection too far, by reading the sequence of every individual's genome to determine their place in life. Another subgenre of speculative fiction is medical fiction, and there is a subgenre called medical science fiction, which explores the potential of cutting edge technology in patient care and medicine, how bodies could be transformed, how bodies could be augmented with technological intervention, how far technology can intervene to cure disability, to cure chronic diseases, how medical technology enhances human longevity, how it can be used for cloning, DNA sequencing. You have the CRISPR technology and all, where you can actually make mutations to your genetic strand. And these are all themes that are popularly explored in medical science fiction. I think that's pretty much by way of introduction. Now I shall move on to the theoretical approaches to science fiction. We shall begin with the Marxist theory. Marxist theory has played an important role in science fiction since the 1960s. And most of the sophisticated studies of science fiction have been either explicitly Marxist in orientation, or they were influenced by Marxian concepts. Science fiction and its what you call a closely related genre of utopian fiction both have deep affinities with Marxist thought in particular and socialist thought in general. In its simplest terms, science fiction and utopian fiction have been concerned with imagining progressive alternatives to the status quo, and often implying critiques of contemporary conditions, or they have been speculating about possible future outcomes of current social trends. And as I mentioned earlier, science fiction imagines change in terms of the whole human species, and these changes that they predict or foresee are often the results of scientific discoveries and inventions that are applied by human beings to their own social evolution. These are also concerns of the Marxist utopian and social imagination. From its earliest forms, utopian fiction, it has depicted imaginary, rational, just societies in opposition to exploitative worldly ones. And Marx valued technology as a vital tool of human liberation. He believed that in a just world, technological innovations were the guarantors of human freedom from toil, just as they were also the means of mass enslavement in an exploitative world order. And utopian socialist thinking was one of the strong formative influences on science fiction of the late 19th century. The most important figures in the development of Anglophone science fiction, like Edward Bellamy, William Morris, H.G. Wells, Jack London, they were all socialists. Wells' utopian writings, like A Modern Utopia, The World Set Free, Men Like Gods, they enjoyed great international popularity. And his favored model was a technocratic world state run by enlightened scientists and engineers. By the early 1920s, however, during the Stalinist regime, Soviet writers were discouraged from writing utopian fantasy that might raise popular expectations and imply a criticism of present conditions. And science fiction and utopian fiction, it was claimed no longer uh, had a role in socialist society. But after Stalin's death in 1953, there was a resurgence of socialist utopian science fiction, inspired especially by Ivan Yefimov's Andromeda Nebula. It was published in 1959, and it was translated into, it was written originally in Russian, and it was translated into English as Andromeda, a space age tale by George Henner. It was made into a film in 1967 that called the Andromeda Nebula. uh, Yefremov, he actually abandoned the image of the socialist man, and he depicted his heroes as quasi-divine. Uh, in another part of the world, in the United States, science fiction developed through pulp magazines into a powerful form of popular literature with very little affinity towards Marxist or socialist ideas. The community of science fiction writers in America actually became increasingly anti socialist and anti communist after the Russian Revolution. And American science fiction literature was dominated by anti utopian themes, especially in the post Second World War period. However, this anti utopian climate in American science fiction, it changed dramatically in the 1960s, uh, inspired by the civil rights movement in America and the sudden independence of many European colonies, and also the unprecedented technological affluence of many capitalist democracies. There was a newfound respect for Marxist ideas, and this desire to rid the world of poverty, racism, sexual repression, economic exploitation was very powerful in at that time. And uh, science fiction as a literary genre, it imagined alternative communities to the bipolar, highly militarized world order of the Cold World War era. It offered a very powerful criticism of the status quo from the vantage point of an imaginary future where the problems of the present time did not exist, or the problems of the present were resolved satisfactorily. And science fiction became one of the privileged instruments of this current of thought. There was an explosive interest, we could say, in science fiction in the US, not only amongst left academics and students, but also in mass culture. You have writers like Samuel Delany, Philip K. Dick, Ursula K. Le Guin, and Joanne Russ, who wrote artistically ambitious and sophisticated science fiction that captured the imagination of the reading public. Uh, However, the developments of science fiction theory went along a different path. In 1973, Darko Suvin and R.D. Mullen, they founded the journal Science Fiction Studies, which became the uh, primary venue for neo-Marxist science fiction criticism. It also published articles by non-Marxist writers. However, Marxist theorists like Frederick Jameson, Tom Moylan, and Carl Friedman, along with Suvin and Mullen, they contributed greatly to the journal. In fact, they gave shape to the concept of critical utopia. It was Tom Moylan who called it by that name. And this became the central core of the science fiction imagination. And in his book, Metamorphosis of Science Fiction, Darko Suvin also introduces a number of concepts that remain central in science fiction criticism, like cognitive estrangement, the concept of the novum, and also science fiction's genetic link with utopia. Now let's move on to another theoretical approach to science fiction, which is based on feminist theory. Now, feminist science fiction is a subgenre of science fiction, and it is considered as a potent vehicle of feminist thought as a means to critique the dominant culture while exploring feminist themes like gender inequality, sexuality, race, reproduction, economics, etc. These themes are illustrated using utopias to explore a society in which gender differences or power imbalances based on gender do not exist, or these are explored as part of dystopian representations to explore worlds in which gender inequalities are intensified or augmented, asserting the need for a feminist intervention. And we can say that no other literary genre so actively invite representations of the ultimate goals of feminism. That is, worlds free of sexism, worlds in which women's contributions to science, especially, are recognized and valued, worlds that explore the diversity of women's desire, sexuality, and also in its representation of worlds that move beyond gender. And feminist critical models of particular interest in the context of science fiction have been actually suggested by cyber theorists like Donna Haraway and Catherine Hales, who are concerned with how developments in contemporary science and technology, for instance, advances in reproductive technologies, are shaping the lives of women. And in her seminal work, Cyborg Manifesto, Donna Haraway, she fuses science fiction imagination with feminism to reconceptualize the cyborg. And she believes that contemporary technoscience, it has promoted the breakdown of categories which were previously thought to be natural, which were previously thought to be inviolable, such as the um, those between the genders, between animals and humans, and also between humans and machines. And the cyborg emerges as a new kind of social being, which is capable of a form of class consciousness. And it kind of subverts our notions about, especially the concept of the female cyborg. It subverts our notions of gender and sexuality. Now, traditionally, science fiction has been considered as an inherently masculinist genre, but it is in the interest of feminist readers to look closely at its potential for imaginative representations of the gendered subject, its diversity, its difference, etc. And the Anglo-American and European feminist revolutions of the 1960s and the 1970s had a definite impact on the writing of science fiction. And uh, feminist science fiction is, we can say that it is a very potent tool for feminist imaginative projects that undertake the cultural and social transformations, which are central to the feminist political enterprise. In fact, science fiction articulates and explores the models of feminine subjectivity and representation in its narrative experiments. And as we know, feminist theory contests the hegemonic representations of patriarchal culture, um, and contemporary cyber theorists like Haraway and Hales, they read science fiction texts as thought experiments that explore the ways in which science and technology has influenced the lives of human beings. And science fiction by feminist writers, especially, they have made use of the image of the alien and the image of the cyborg to investigate the perspectives and experiences of um, the others, the hegemonic cultures, traditional others. And with Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, the figure of the cyborg has suddenly become a very privileged theoretical representation in feminist cultural studies about of the impacts of science and technology in subverting conventional representations of human subjectivity and also human embodiment. In fact, the image of the cyborg, it problematizes the status of man, the status of woman, the human. It also problematizes the concepts of race, gender, body, and identity. And critics like Haraway, they read science fiction for the ways in which it actually reimagines our lives as contemporary cyborgs, shaped by the project of science and technology. And they recognize the political urgency of feminist participation in the articulation and representation of futures. Uh, I would like to mention very briefly about eco-criticism as a tool employed in science fiction studies. Uh, with the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962 and the subsequent awakening of the environment movement, science fiction writers across the world, they began to deliberate on the impact of human actions on our biosphere. And we have several post-apocalyptic novels like Neville Shute's On the Beach. Uh, we have works predicting the impending collapse of our environment, such as David Brin's Earth. Then you have Dennis Danvers' The Fourth World, which was published in 2000. And environmental concern, it has led to large scale depictions of entire planets and multiple societies grappling with the problem of terraforming our biosphere to make it conducible to human habitation and human interests. And we can say that Frank Herbert's Dune, which was published in 1965, the Dune series, it is considered as the first planetary ecology novel written on a grand scale, where different cultures and political groups, they attempt to control the desert planet Arrakis. Similarly, you have Kim Stanley Robinson's Red Mask, which was published in 1992. It presents a very compelling depiction of the Martian landscape and how, and it talks about the human initiatives to control the Martian terrain in order to facilitate human habitation. Robinson has also written another novel called Antarctica, which was published in 1998, which depicts the destruction of the continent's ecology due to human intervention and global warming. And so eco-criticism can be employed as a potent tool for analyzing science fiction texts. Moving on to gender studies, um, being a very predominantly androcentric genre since its inception, with its explicit focus on masculine endeavors like science and technology, there was an explosion of considerations of gender in traditional science fiction. And Brian Atterby in Science Fiction and the Gender of Knowledge, published in 2000, he observes the master narrative of science has always been told in sexual terms. It represents knowledge, innovation, and even perception as masculine, while nature, the passive object of exploration, is described as feminine. But over time, science fiction texts have increasingly engaged with gender issues, disrupting, challenging, destabilizing, and subverting the normative cultural understandings. And we need to look at the constructions of masculinity within the broader field of androcentric science fiction in order to understand this subversion of gender notions. And one powerful image of masculinity in science fiction from the 1930s to the 1950s, roughly, was that of the Superman, a human with superior intellectual and scientific prowess. The plays of an example is Edmund Hall in Stanley Weinbaum's novel, The New Adam. However, the plays of women characters in science fiction and the cultural constructions of masculinity and femininity in science fiction have been the subject of intense debate since the 1970s, especially with the emergence of feminist science fiction narratives. And the image of the alien could signify everything that was other to the dominant white male Western audience. And this image of the alien could symbolize women, people of color, other nationalities, classes, and also other or deviant sexualities. And in the name of keeping science fiction pure of trivial, childish, immature love interests, the male fans of science fiction, the editors of science fiction magazines, and also science fiction writers, they pursued exclusionary tactics to situate these women characters outside the masculine domain of science and science fiction. Women simply had no place in the logical terrain of science fiction. They had no place in the scientific cerebral topos of science fiction. However, all these changed with time, and we have the battle of the sexist stories, depictions of social order, where the traditional gender hierarchies are subverted or overturned, where women rule. All these emerged in the latter part of the 20th century. And we have several woman-dominant narratives in science fiction, which reveal a latent anxiety about the changes and the threats to the gendered structuring or the gendered order. And we have several depictions of self-sustaining matriarchal societies, which are seen as a potential feminine challenge to the gendered hierarchical order. For example, you have Heart of Gold by Sharon Shin, where she depicts an aristocratic, pastoral, matriarchal race called Indigo. Again, there is another work called Friend Island by Frances Stevens, where she presents a society where women are admittedly the superior race. Interestingly, there is also another humorous work by Leslie Stone called The Conquest of Gola. Um, it talks about a male invasion of a matriarchal planet, but this invasion is successfully resisted primarily because the invaders cannot believe that the planet is in fact ruled by women. It's a very humorous work. Then talking about the female alien images, um, we have uh, writers like C.L. Moore, um, who depicts cyborg characters, female cyborgs. Um, uh, for example, she has created a fictional character called a female cyborg character called Deirdre, and she invests this uh, female cyborg with feminine attributes of grace and beauty, and at the same time, this cyborg is also endowed with hypermasculine qualities like superhuman strength and agility. And this creation actually resembles uh, Asimov's fictional female cyborg, Dors Venabili, uh, a character in his famed Foundation series. And both these female cyborg characters, they offer powerful insights into the nature of female beauty and power, into the nature of embodiment, and what actually it means to be human. And technology in science fiction, it evolves into a site of cultural anxieties about gender. In Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers, he presents a race of prosthetically enhanced troopers, which are aggressive, which are hyper masculine images placed in a high-tech environment. Thus, we could say that technological development actually challenges or pushes the boundaries of the organic, and it threatens the embodied qualities of physical strength that we normally associate with masculinity, that informs social constructions of masculinity. And in the very famous work by Ursula K. Le Guin, The Left Hand of Darkness, she depicts an androgynous society where the inhabitants of planet Winter, they have the potential to both give birth and also to father a child. Uh, and feminist utopias actually disrupt the uh, perceived naturalness of gender, and it presents extended families or communities as an alternative to the nuclear family, where parenting is shared amongst numerous mothers, and these mothers can be either male or female. And many of these feminist utopian depictions, they promote they depict societies that promote freedom of sexual expression, including homosexuality. In fact, there is a work by Marge Piercy called "Woman on the Edge of Time," where she presents a androgynous society where artificial wombs are used for childbearing, so that no one gives birth, but both men and women mother or breastfeed. So such representations of um, gender are very common in science fiction, where the traditional um, depictions of gender are subverted or challenged. And we can say that um, science fiction offers a very poignant, very powerful critique of female stereotypes and also the masculinist tropes. And it very consciously, it disrupts the gender hierarchies and it reconstitutes the woman as human. And it renders a multiple, we can say, shifting postmodernist sense of female selfhood, and the dichotomy of sex and gender becomes quite irrelevant and meaningless, as all kinds of gender and sexual differences are celebrated in science fiction. And I would like to wind up by referring to race and ethnicity in science fiction. Now, as a genre, science fiction actually talks about experiences of alienation in its depictions of deviant identities, other nationalities, and also different sexualities. However, Nalo Hopkinson, a writer of science fiction, she points out that there is in fact, very little representation by alienated people themselves in the writing of science fiction. Most English language science fiction is written by whites. And science fiction written by African Americans tend to be categorized under the umbrella term African American literature. And this kind of sidelining, as Hopkinson says, is visible even in the case of speculative fiction written by Native Americans, Mexicans, and also writers from the Indian subcontinent. And science fiction writers who come from other racial and ethnic backgrounds, they use their imaginative potential to foresee a future where existing social problems or racial tensions, problems of suppression, marginalization, and discrimination are solved, or they foresee a future where these problems are magnified, extended, or projected, or they kind of project these problems into a dystopian future. Here also the visualizations of utopia and dystopia becomes very relevant. But these depictions are always constructed, they are always colored and, so to say, textured by their social and cultural experiences. And the treatment of racial and ethnic tropes by white writers actually falls short of representing the values and concerns of the minority culture. Very often they tend to disregard or ignore such racial tensions, and they take for granted the invisibility of the people of color. However, we have several science fiction texts that responds to racial tensions, uh, uh, texts that project this variance onto depictions of alien human conflicts, as in Mike Resnick's work, A Miracle of Rare Design, which was published in 1994. Now, in this work, what Resnick does is that the tension between the Western culture and the African culture is projected onto a storyline about humans and aliens, where the marginalized minority is uh, quite expectedly accommodated invariably in the image of the alien or the other. Thus, we can say that science fiction responds to racial intersections and racial relationships. You have Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles as early as 1950, which addresses racial relations. It replays the issue of colonialism and invasion through its plot line, where humans invade the planet Mars and they eventually settle on Mars. Octavia Butler's work, Kindred, which was published in 1979, it has a Black female protagonist who travels back to an early 19th century plantation in Maryland. Here, Butler makes use of the plot of time travel to write about slavery and racial discrimination. Again, you have another work, another interesting novel by Orson Scott Card, which is called Past Watch, The Redemption of Christopher Columbus, published in 1996. It actually takes a very, it has the European conquest of the Americas as its historical frame, and its characters come from different ethnic backgrounds, and its plot is about an attempt to change history. And Christopher Columbus's interactions with the native people that he encounters in the Caribbean and the Americas. It shows how Black people can actually influence white people and prevent slavery. Now, these two novels, Kindred and Past Watch, despite the obvious differences between the two novels and the different ways in which they have approached this issue of racism and slavery, both works actually find ways to voice the concerns of the marginalized, of the alienated people. Neil Stephenson, another writer, he in his work The Diamond Age, he sets his future world of nanotechnology in China. And this future world is inhabited by people of all races and nationalities. So race and ethnicity is one of the central concerns of modern science fiction, and writers of science fiction do not shy away from the treatment of such themes in their works. And as a continually evolving genre, the investigation of racial concerns would actually transform it from a literature of ideas to a very powerful and potent literature of change. I think I'll stop there. I'll be happy to take questions. Talking about the title of the talk, A Reality Ahead of Schedule, it is actually I am not sure whether you're familiar with Sidney Mead or Sid Mead. He's an American industrial designer, author, and he is also a new futurist concept artist, a designer. He is famous for his designs for science fiction films like the Blade Runner Aliens, 2010 A Space Odyssey, the Star Trek series. He is basically a visual artist, a designer who designs futuristic worlds in films. This is how Sidney Mead defined science fiction. He called science fiction reality ahead of schedule. So it's from him that I have borrowed the title of the talk. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. You have given a very good, you have enlightened us with this new concept, I mean, science fiction. The title itself is somewhat new because it is dichotomy, science and fiction. So you have given a clear cut idea about what is what. And you have explained the significance of science fiction, how it developed from 18th and 19th centuries onwards. And in that, you have given an idea of utopian desire and dystopian fear. Then science fiction is purely didactic. These are all the points which you have mentioned. And the theoretical approach to science fiction and the metamorphosis of science fiction, feminist science fiction, eco-criticism, in that aspect, how it functions, and gender studies, you have given a clear-cut picture of science fiction. For that, we are very thankful to you, ma'am. And I mean, participants, please post your questions. Ma'am,
Yes.
ma'am, they have, yes. This, ma'am, Alvin Mark has asked some question. My question for you today, ma'am, as we discussed about various writers on the genre of science fiction, and most of them are whites, but why I couldn't we find many Indian writers for this genre, ma'am?
Okay.
This is the question asked by Alvin Mark, Mr. Alvin Mark.
Yeah, I have read this question. Now, actually, there is one novel by Satyajit Ray. Just me, just let me check the title. Yeah, it was written in 1962 by the award-winning Indian writer and filmmaker Satyajit Ray, and the story is titled Banku Babur Bandhu, and it translates into Banku Babu's friend. And the work is also known as The Alien. And contrary to earlier portrayals of aliens as dangerous creatures, Satyajit Ray actually depicts his alien from outer space as a kind and playful being invested with magical powers and who is capable of interacting with children. Of course, there are writers of science fiction in India. You have Amitav Ghosh also, who explores such themes in his writing.
Please, next. Please. Participants, if you are willing to ask question, please, you can post your questions in the chat box.
Only one question. In fact, we have one science fiction text in Malayalam called Madhuram Gayadi by O.V. Vijayan, which also has very predominant science fictional elements.
Ma'am, Aarti Priya ma'am asked one question. Can Professor Martin DC
Yes.
character, Wonder Woman, be considered a feminist reaction to the predominantly male-centered comic scene, or is Wonder Woman also a product of the patriarchal pop culture, keeping in mind that the bisexuality of the original Wonder Woman is not overtly stated or discussed?
Is the question in the chat box?
Yes, ma'am.
I couldn't find it.
The first question, ma'am.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Feminist reaction to the predominantly. As long as the Wonder Woman is a creation of the patriarchal pop culture, as we read it, uh, we can say that it is definitely a construction of the patriarchal pop culture, and we have several powerful feminine images in science fiction, especially in the Star Trek series and all, where uh, they are acknowledged for their intelligence, but at the same time, the image of the female, she is depicted as a very beautiful, graceful creature. And when you talk about the image of the Wonder Woman, um, uh, the power is invested in the image of the feminine there. And it is certainly a creation of the pop culture, the patriarchal pop culture. But with the advent of the feminist readings of science fiction texts, these female characters have all been brought under the scanner, and they have been studied as representations of popular feminine and masculine representations.
Thank you, ma'am. Dr. Melvin sir posted another question, ma'am.
Yes, yes, I
Ma'am,
can read it.
yeah, ma'am, do you think literary history has forgotten Edgar Allan Poe, who is a pioneer in, sorry,
In the science fiction
in the
concepts of
science
space
fiction?
exploration, dark holes?
Yes, ma'am. And moon exploration.
No, definitely. He has not been forgotten. Due to constraints of time, I didn't mention, that's all. He is definitely there.
Yes, ma'am, another question, ma'am. Ma'am, how does science fiction look at religion from the perspective existentialism, where people are bereft of a creator, God, a superpower, and cast into existence and are in the hands of technological soft power?
Yeah. Now, science fiction has always mm, been interested in creating characters which imitate the power of God. We have several characters from Frankenstein, especially in medical fiction, where doctors create new life in laboratories. This playing God thing has always been one of the most interesting tropes in science fiction. And coming back to your question, yes, we can see an absence of religion in science fiction texts. In fact, that aspect is not overtly stressed in science fiction texts. The focus is always on how science and technology intervenes in human affairs, and how civilization is constructed on the shoulders of scientific and technological development. And very often we find societies at the mercy of technological power. But humanity always has a center stage. And science fiction texts ultimately celebrate the essence of being human, even as it deliberates on the impacts of science and technology. Yes, I would answer that it doesn't place much emphasis on religion. It doesn't talk about religion. It's not that it disregards or rejects religion. Science fiction does not talk about religion.
Thank you, ma'am. The last question, ma'am. Are some science fiction stories getting inspired by scientists? Robots are considered as science fiction in literature before, but now it is a modern technology. So is this genre helping science, ma'am?
Now, science fiction is a literary genre that is based on hard science. Definitely, the innovations, the technological innovations, and scientific discoveries have fueled science fiction, have been the raw materials of science fiction. Now, we have Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote about man's journey to the moon, and 20 years later, we had our first man on the moon. So, science fiction stories definitely inspire scientists. And in fact, most of these writers of science fiction are scientists themselves. They are highly educated people who are in the thick of things. And based on their scientific knowledge, based on their reading, based on their understanding of the cosmos, these writers write about futuristic developments. They construct future worlds in their novels, which are largely sustained by technological discoveries and inventions. So, as a genre, science fiction definitely encourages scientists to explore new avenues and to utilize the potential of science for creating a better future for mankind. And you mentioned robots. Yes, robots were initially imaginary, purely fictional creations, but now it has, especially in Japan and Korea, it has become a robot is a household entity nowadays. It has become very common. It's part of modern technology. It's part of our life. So this genre is actually helping scientists to orient their research, to explore new avenues, and also to it encourages them to explore the potentials of science and technology.
Thank you, ma'am. On behalf of the Department of English, I thank you, ma'am, very much. You have given a very good, you have enlightened us in this particular topic. And once again, I would like to thank you, ma'am, and I would like to thank Dr. Arun Lal. Yesterday, Sir has given her his speech. The title post-humanism, and we are very thankful to you. And I have to thank Dr. SF sir. He is the backbone of this program, and I mean this title, science fiction, also the brainchild of Dr. SF sir. For that, we are very thankful to him. And on behalf of the Department of English, once again, I thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.